Class. Well, good morning. It's good to be with you all. You'll have to excuse my voice. I got sick on Friday and I just sound bad. So sorry about that. I'm not angry with MC leaders, I promise. That was Richard's joke. Made me very uncomfortable, so I guess mission accomplished by Richard. Good job. I'm not upset with that. But if you are an MC leader, please let me know how your group is going to help on the day of the event. It will be a good one. Well, if you have your Bibles, open them to Luke chapter 5. We're going to start in verse 33, as you heard read. We've been in the book of Luke for a while now, and Luke's gospel is a gospel that shows how Jesus is the fulfillment of Israel's story. And it puts forth a gospel for the margins and the world. And so we see in this gospel that Jesus came to proclaim good news to the poor and to set the captive free. That the gospel is for everyone, and especially for those who are disenfranchised and overlooked. And as this good news spreads, we also begin to see that it forms a countercultural kingdom community. And most recently in chapter 5, we saw Jesus interacting with outcasts, with sinners, and with the sick. We saw Jesus willingly embrace the outcast when he heals the man with leprosy. And rather than the uncleanness of the leper, which is what the Pharisees were afraid of, which is what the whole Jewish community was afraid of because of the law, rather than the uncleanness of the leper being transferred to Jesus, when Jesus touches the leper, his purity is transferred to the man with leprosy. We also saw how Jesus does what we cannot do for ourselves when he healed the paralytic. He doesn't just heal the paralytic so that he can walk, but he actually first began by forgiving his sin. And then he healed his body to show that he actually had the authority to forgive sin. See, Jesus does what we cannot do for ourselves by healing us through forgiveness. Are you okay? Man, he's having a rough one today, I think. All right, I'm locking in here. Here we go. So Jesus does what we can't do for ourselves by healing us through forgiveness. But then we also saw last week that Jesus brings healing to those who know they are sick. And this is actually a really important passage for us to make sure we understand before we get into our passage for this morning. We're talking about the passage of the call of Levi. So Jesus calls Levi, who we know more commonly as Matthew. And Matthew was a dirty, low-life, despicable, outcast tax collector. And so just the call of Levi is surprising in and of itself. But not only did he call Levi, then Levi threw a rager of a party with all of his other sinner, disgusting friends. And Jesus went to the party, and he was hanging out. And this really upset the Pharisees. They could not understand how Jesus would be around these people and be around this kind of party. And so when they question him, they want to know why he does that. And Jesus answers in a really profound way. He says that he has come to bring healing and salvation to those who know that they are sick. He brought salvation for the unrighteous, not the righteous. Now, this concept we need to be clear on before we get to today's passage, because Jesus wasn't telling the Pharisees that he thought they were righteous and so they didn't need saving. And he also wasn't telling them that he would not save them because they refused to recognize how sick they were with sin. He's trying to communicate with them. He wants them to understand what it is that they're missing. And the Pharisees are missing one really key thing, which is the nature of the problem that Jesus has come to solve. The Pharisees think that the problem is that the Romans in particular, for their oppression of the Jews, and then any sinner, any person who doesn't strive to follow the law, these people are the problem, and that the Messiah needs to come and rid the world of these dirty, nasty sinners and these oppressive Romans who are there just oppressing us righteous Jews and Pharisees. And so they're looking for a Messiah to come and liberate them from Rome and to judge all evil on the spot, just not their evil. They're going to leave that part alone. The problem, however, wasn't that sinners that Pharisees thought were dirty or Romans who were oppressing them needed to be dealt with so that the righteous could be rescued from them. The problem was that everyone, Pharisees included, were inflicted with the disease of sin. And Jesus came to heal the sick and the poor who know their need, not to crush those who are living under the death that sin brings to us all. He's trying to help the Pharisees understand the problem is sin and death, and the cure is actually forgiveness. They believed the problem was other people and how disgusting they were. Jesus attempts to make clear to them that he actually came not to crush these people, but to set them free. He lets us know the nature of his mission and what he's up to. And that actually leads us directly to our passage for the day. So in verse 33, the Pharisees respond to Jesus after he tells them what he's up to, that he came to save and he came to heal. He came for the unrighteous, not the righteous. He came for the sick, not the healthy. And the implication is that all are sick and all are unrighteous. And so they hear this and they're confused still. They really don't get Jesus. And here's how they respond. So he says this to them, and then they said, well, the disciples of John fast often and they offer prayers, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees, but yours eat and drink. And so what Jesus just said about the nature of what he is up to in this world clearly goes right over their head. They're hung up on the fact that Jesus' disciples and their attempts at righteousness do not fit the mold that they believe that it should. And so Jesus responds, and he says something that's maybe a little cryptic to us. Jesus said to them, "Can you make wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in those days." So, what does Jesus mean here? His answer is full of Old Testament imagery. When you read the prophets, there's imagery all over the place where God references himself and his people in a marriage relationship. God as the groom, his people as the bride. And this is imagery, these are references that the Pharisees are for sure going to pick up on. It's something that they get. So there's all this wedding language used to describe God's relationship to his people and to describe the covenant with them. And so Jesus is making a pretty clear claim here. He is equating himself to Yahweh, to God, to the groom in the situation of this marriage and of this covenant, and his disciples as the people of God. And what he is hinting at, which the Pharisees definitely pick up on, is a new covenant. That he is coming to establish a new covenant between God and his people. But there's probably a little bit more going on here. Jesus is likely referencing a folk story that was commonly known, especially to the Pharisees. You can actually read it in 4th Ezra, other writings, non-canonical books. It was a common story. And it's a story about a groom and his bride, and there's kind of 3 stages of getting married in this culture. There's the betrothal period, then there's the actual wedding, a 7-day-long party, feast, and then there's consummation. And so in this story, the bride and the groom have just finished their 7-day-long marriage ceremony and their party, and they are going to consummate. And when they go to enter the chambers, the groom drops dead. And so this was a story that actually was about the destruction of the temple. The groom dropping dead at the moment where the covenant was to be finalized is a symbol of how the temple was destroyed, leaving God's covenant people without a way to consummate their worship to God. And actually, from my understanding, to this day, the Jewish people still hold a strict fast on the day to commemorate when the temple was destroyed. And so the Pharisees are asking why Jesus' disciples don't observe the traditional fasts. And Pharisees fasted every Monday and Thursday to commemorate and mourn the loss of the temple. And so Jesus is saying something pretty big here. If you think back on everything you know that Jesus has said about himself, you'll know that coming soon, Jesus is also going to reference himself as the temple. And he says that if you destroy this temple in 3 days, I will rebuild it. So Jesus says the reason that his disciples aren't fasting like the Pharisees are is because the groom isn't dead yet. They're partying. They're at the wedding. It would be really weird to fast when you're at a feast. It's inappropriate. The groom is still present. Jesus is still with them. And the temple, Jesus, the true temple, where heaven meets earth, where people can come to find communion with God himself, is still intact. And so there's no reason to fast. There is reason to feast. But there is a day coming when the bridegroom will indeed die, or the temple will be, so to speak, destroyed. And then his disciples will fast and mourn. And it's actually interesting to note that the early church took these words of Jesus very literally, very early on in church history. And this was kind of codified in the Didache by 110 AD. Christians had moved the fast from Mondays and Thursdays to Wednesdays and Fridays, because Wednesday was the day that Jesus was betrayed and Friday was the day that he died. And so they literally fast on the day that the bridegroom was taken from them, that the temple was, quote unquote, destroyed. And so traditionally in the church, every Wednesday and Friday there is a fast, and it is connected to these very words of Jesus, the day that he was betrayed and the day that he died. And then they shifted the day of celebration to Sundays, the day of his resurrection. So Jesus answers their questions about fasting by claiming to be God himself in the flesh, who has come to establish a new covenant, and that he himself is the temple where people will celebrate their connection to God. That's kind of a weird response, honestly. I mean, there's a lot going on there, and so Jesus seeks to clarify. He wants to make his point clear. So he uses two different analogies that Luke calls parables. And the first one is, he says that no one tears a piece from a new garment and puts it on an old garment. If he does, he's going to tear the new garment, and it's not going to match the old garment anyway. And that's common sense, right? You buy a brand new piece of clothing and cut it up and ruin it to patch an old garment, and now it's not even going to match. So neither garment is really worth much of anything. And then he explains that no one puts new wine into old wineskins. Wineskins were made out of leather at the time, and when they're fresh, they're pliable, they can move, but over time they become brittle and they crack. If you put new wine into an old wineskin, that wine will continue to ferment and expand, and it will burst the old wineskin, and the skin and the wine will be ruined. So you have to put new wine into fresh wineskins so that it has the space to ferment and grow the way it needs to, and the skin does not burst. And then he ends these parables by saying, but people who drink the old wine have trouble liking new wine because they've gotten used to the old stuff. Get it? That makes sense, doesn't it? So, again, what's his point? Jesus is still trying to explain to them a similar concept he's trying to explain to the Pharisees when they ask about the party with Levi. They are trying to approach God in a way that isn't going to work. Jesus has come to do a new thing, and this new thing does not work with the old thing. He came to make a new covenant, not one that contradicts the old. In fact, he even tells us that he fulfills the old covenant. He fills it full to overflowing. And so now, the way to come to God is not through empty acts of piety. Not that it ever was, by the way, but that is how the old covenant began to be interpreted by the Pharisees and people of the time. They were obsessed with outward acts of piety, believing that if they could be righteous enough, they would fulfill the law and therefore be acceptable to God and be able to be in relationship with him. But Jesus is saying this is a new covenant, and you come to God not through your own efforts of righteousness, but by the grace and forgiveness that is extended to us by Jesus himself. The Pharisees are stuck on what they think is the right way and are missing that even their frantic attempts at righteousness are symptoms of the sickness of sin that Jesus has come to heal and forgive. A new covenant and a new way has come and has fulfilled the old way and is now pushing that deeper and deeper into the heart level and casting the net wider and wider to anybody who would want to receive the mercy of Jesus. And then he kind of just ends his weird parable by saying, by the way, no one after drinking old wine desires new, for he says the old is good. And isn't that the case? It's no surprise that you don't like the new when you've become accustomed to the old. This would be a hard transition, wouldn't it? You're used to one thing for a really long time, and that thing helps you feel a sense of control, that you are able to do something about coming to God. And Jesus is saying, actually, that's not how this has ever worked. And so it would be no surprise that the Pharisees or other law-abiding Jews would have trouble embracing the new way of Jesus. You see, you and I, we find ourselves in the in-between time of Christ's resurrection and yet waiting for his return. And so we have this weird thing where we feast in celebration that Jesus is alive. And we also are waiting for him to return. And so we fast. Well, maybe we actually physically fast. But we are caught in the emotions of both, aren't we? That Jesus is alive, and so we know all is well, and yet we wait for his return to come and make all things whole again. And so we have joyous celebration, and yet somber, mournful waiting and watching, waiting for him to come and return. And we live in this weird in-between time. And so what we're seeing in this section of Scripture is that Jesus has come to heal our sin sickness and invite us into a new way of communing with God that's full of joyful worship and watchful waiting. Jesus has come with a new way of communing with God. And the way of Jesus is one that is full of joyful worship but watchful waiting. We're caught in the in-between of the celebration of having a living God who yet promises to come one day and make all things right. And because of Jesus, we now know what it means to approach God on his terms. That it is simply through humble submission to Jesus and acceptance of his forgiveness that we are able to come to God. Full stop. And so these next two sections are examples of how this new way of Jesus impacts how one relates to God and to righteousness, and has brought us to a fuller experience and heart-level relationship with God. And so starting in chapter 6, verse 1, on a Sabbath, while he was going through the grain fields, His disciples plucked and ate some heads of grain, rubbing them in their hands. But some of the Pharisees said, "Why are you doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath?" And so, here's what's going on here. You're not allowed to work on the Sabbath. The day of Sabbath is a day of rest, where you don't work, you trust God's provision, you trust that He works when you rest, and that you are safe in Him, and you celebrate relationship with God. And so the Sabbath day was to be kept holy. It's a day of worship, a day of rest, a day of trust, a day of celebration. And in an attempt, and I think actually motivated at the beginning by good intentions, there were all kinds of extra rules set up around the law to make sure that the law itself wasn't transgressed. And so the problem wasn't that these guys were walking through somebody else's field and stealing grain. In fact, that was allowable in the law, that if you were hungry and walking through a field, you were able to gather what you could with your hands, as long as you didn't use tools or take too much. You should be able to eat what you need to be sustained. So the problem wasn't that they were stealing from somebody. Do you know what the problem was for the Pharisees? This. The rubbing of the wheat in their hands to get rid of the chaff so they could eat it. That was considered harvesting, and that was work. So why are you doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath? Now, Jesus answered them. This is verse 3. "Have you not read what David did when he was hungry, and he and those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and took and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for anybody but the priest to eat, and also gave it to those with him. And he said to him, 'The Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath.'" So Jesus responds to this question. They want to know, why are you doing what's unlawful? And then Jesus says, hey, do you remember this story about David? And maybe, I don't know if you remember, I think it's in 1 Samuel 22. That should be in my notes, sorry. Anyway, David at this point is already anointed king, but he has not yet taken the throne, and he's actually on the run from Saul, who is trying to kill him. And so him and his merry men are running around trying to get away from Saul and not be killed by him. And so they're in and out of caves, they're living in the wilderness, they're just trying to stay out of sight, but they're starving. And so they come to the tabernacle, and they're seeking something to eat, and the only food around is the bread of the presence, which is consecrated only for priests to eat. And David ate the bread and then gave it to his men as well. And they were never reprimanded for it. They were never told it wasn't okay. They were never punished. It was an acceptable acceptance to the law or to the rule. And so Jesus says, hey, do you remember this story about David? He recounts the story, and then he says, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So there's at least a couple things going on here that commentators talk about. One, Jesus is very clearly equating himself with the anointed one of God. He says, yes, do you remember David, the anointed one of God? When he was in a situation where the law needed to be broken in order for his needs to be met, he did so, and it was acceptable. I am the anointed one of God. I am Lord of the Sabbath. And so I think he's saying two things. He's claiming the authority of God and to be the one who does not just communicate the law, but is himself the lawgiver. So he's similar to Moses, but greater. Moses communicated the law. Jesus is the giver of the law. So he's claiming authority. More authority than David, more authority than Moses. He's claiming the authority of God himself over the law. He says, I am Lord of the Sabbath. And this is a similar phrase, if you remember back when he healed the paralytic. He said, so that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. Get up and walk. So you may know that the Son of Man has authority. So he is the Lord of the Sabbath. He's saying that he determines the purpose and the boundaries of Sabbath. And if God's anointed human king could find mercy and have his needs met even though he wasn't a priest, how much more could God's anointed Messiah, the lawgiver himself, find mercy and care for his needs on the Sabbath, even if it was outside the boundaries that the Pharisees had created? So here's what's going on. Jesus is the anointed one of God who uses his authority to extend mercy and care. This is revolutionary for the Pharisees. So he tells them that he has come with a new covenant, a new way of approaching God, and now he's interacting with the Sabbath in a way that they do not get. And he says, actually, you're missing the point of the Sabbath. I am Lord of the Sabbath. I have authority to determine what the Sabbath is for and what happens. And I use my authority for the Sabbath to be a space where you extend mercy and care for those who are in need. And then there's another story again about the Sabbath, starting in verse 6. On another Sabbath, he entered the synagogue and was teaching, and a man was there whose right hand was withered. And these scribes and the Pharisees watched him to see whether he would heal on the Sabbath, so that they might find a reason to accuse him. So the Pharisees had another rule. You could heal on the Sabbath if it was life-threatening. So if somebody's life was in danger, you could heal. But if they weren't going to die, you had to wait until the next day. You couldn't work on the Sabbath, so you can't heal on the Sabbath. And so they're just sitting back. They're like, okay, here we go. Here's this guy with a messed up hand. What's Jesus going to do? And they're wanting to trap Jesus here. They're just sitting back and waiting. And Jesus, it says, he knows their thoughts. So he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come and stand here." And he rose and stood there. So he brings this man front and center in the synagogue, and everybody's watching. And then Jesus asked the Pharisees, "I ask you, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to destroy it?" This is a great question, because as much as the Pharisees are wanting to see Jesus mess up, he's put them in a trap. You can't answer that question in a good way. Well, I mean, there probably is a good answer, but not in a way that they want to answer, right? Well, they have to say it's right to do good and to save life. But if they say that, then they admit that it's okay for Jesus to heal. And they don't want to admit that. They want to trap him because they don't like how he handles these things. So Jesus looks all of them in the eye. That part's actually fun to imagine. So he asks them this penetrating question. He just stares them in the eyes. And he said to this guy, "Stretch out your hand." And when he did, his hand was healed. And it just says, they were filled with fury and discussed with one another what they might do to Jesus. They were angry that Jesus healed this guy. And Jesus was a little in their face about it. He asked them a question they couldn't really answer. And then while looking them in the eyes, he's like, "Healed. What do you think of that?" And they're angry. They don't like it. And they start plotting. So the Pharisees are clearly still missing the point. See, they had turned Sabbath and relationship with God into a place of restriction, control, judgment, and fear. And the only way to come close to God was to be perfect. And the way it developed for them, even if that meant ignoring the needs of those around you, that's what you got to do. So Jesus confronts that. The Sabbath wasn't meant to be a burden on the people to be sure they didn't step out of line. And it was for sure not intended to be used as an excuse to ignore the clear needs of those around us. If our piety, if our attempts at righteousness lead us to judgment, fear, and rigidity, if we are unable to see those around us with compassion because we are so appalled at their sin or so concerned that they might make us dirty, we have misunderstood not just the Sabbath, but the way of Jesus as a whole. You see, the way of Jesus is the way of fullness, mercy, and goodness. The way of Jesus is the way of fullness, mercy, and goodness. And so when we think about these three stories that we went over this morning, and we see that Jesus came with a new covenant, a new way of approaching God. And we see that Jesus has authority over this new covenant and over what it means to come to God, but he uses his authority to extend mercy and care. And when we see that his way is a way of fullness and mercy and goodness, we must ask ourselves, how is it that we understand our relationship to God and how we come to him? Or maybe more direct to this text, who in these stories do you find yourself resonating with as a character? Because the problem of the Pharisees is actually a problem, and the exact kind of problem that some of us may have. There is still, I think this is becoming more and more rare in our culture, but there is still an approach to faith and an approach to God that is so worried about sin management and the dirty, disgusting sinners of the world that it leads to a holy huddle where the imperfect and the needy are ignored in the name of piety. Where people will become undeserving of love because their particular brand of sin is too disgusting and grotesque to us. But we just kind of pick and choose what sin that is, and we can ignore our own. But that is not the way of Jesus. He has come to heal our sin with forgiveness, to free us to worship with joy and watchful waiting, with hearts open to what he may be doing in the world around us, ready to get our hands dirty with compassion and mercy. And this is an age-old problem. This is why the prophet Amos writes this: "For I know how many are your transgressions and how great are your sins, you who afflict the righteous, who take a bribe and turn aside the needy in the gate. I hate, I despise your feasts, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. And the peace offerings of your fattened animals, I will not look upon them. Take away from me the noise of your songs. To the melody of your harps I will not listen, but let justice roll down like water, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." See, a righteousness that's devoid of compassion and mercy and justice is not righteousness, it is evil. And that is a possible trap that we can fall into in the church. And we draw really weird boundaries and lines the same way the Pharisees did. And sometimes I think we're a little hard on the Pharisees. These were devoted people. They wanted to be righteous. They wanted to know God. And lots of times, our own attempts at Pharisaism are actually attempts at being close to God. They might be motivated well in some way, but it gets twisted. It gets twisted into something else, into something that's actually quite evil. But on the outside, it looks good. And that's what's so destructive about it, right? We've learned to manage our sin. We've learned to keep ourselves clean from the dirty world around us. And so it looks like the way of Jesus, but it's actually a bastardization of what Jesus is doing in our hearts and in the world and of who he is. However, there's another way to miss the boat when it comes to this stuff with Jesus. Maybe we struggle with being Pharisees. And we probably go in and out of that. Like I said, we kind of draw our own weird boundaries and boxes, and there's certain things that are like really big no-nos for us, and then we have these huge blind spots that we just are fine with. But probably culturally a much more relatable problem is that we are given to permissiveness, not legalism. We're given to permissiveness, not legalism. And that's the other way to miss the point of what Jesus is doing in us and the world. Maybe you read these passages and you're like, man, I get where the Pharisees are coming from, if you're honest with yourself. It's hard for us. Like we always, myself included, we want to read these passages and we want to identify with the heroes of the passage. We always want to think that we understand Jesus, and if we were there in that time, we would handle it the right way and we wouldn't be like the Pharisees. Or we wouldn't somehow be like the tax collectors and the sinners. But I think for a lot of us, if we don't resonate with the Pharisees, we really do resonate with the tax collectors and the sinners. Because what can happen is we might have compassion for others, because even culturally, that's like a good thing. Like caring for the poor and the outcast, like culturally, people applaud that. They like that part of Jesus, right? That's a really palatable part of following Jesus. But sometimes we may have compassion for others, but have little concern for piety and righteousness. And that also misses what Jesus is doing. He did not come to heal the sick and care for the poor and then party and live exactly like the tax collectors and the sinners. He came to heal the sick and to call sinners to repentance, to offer forgiveness as the path to freedom from the destruction of our sin. You see, we can't excuse our lack of love and compassion with our own piety, but we cannot excuse our sin in the name of forgiveness and grace. The way of Jesus is a new way, and it's not based upon our ability to be righteous, but it is also not the way of life where we are continually ravaged by the destruction of our sin. There is freedom and victory in Jesus. There is healing in Jesus. And so, yes, you might be like a Pharisee at times, where you're disgusted by the nastiness of everybody around you. But probably in our culture, we're much more apt to just excuse a lot of sin in the name of compassion, mercy, forgiveness, and grace. But neither of those options are the way of Jesus. Jesus came to heal and forgive, and to bring us into a kingdom that's marked by compassion, love, mercy, and freedom from the sin that seeks to destroy our souls. The fullness of the kingdom of God is available to us when we choose to live in the freedom of forgiveness that produces righteousness, and to extend mercy and care to the poor, the needy, and the outcast. And so, Christina, if you want to head back up, I'm starting to wrap up here. And so some questions, just a couple of questions for us to consider as we think about Jesus' interactions with the Pharisees here. In what ways are we like the Pharisees, stuck in our own ways of striving, and yet hearts hard toward the things that God has compassion and space for? And secondly, in what ways do we disregard the freedom available to us through forgiveness and hide behind compassion as an excuse to dabble in the sin we have been freed from? How are we like the Pharisees, and how are we like the tax collectors and the sinners? And as you think through those questions, if you can look yourself in the mirror and be honest with yourself, that you are a Pharisee and a tax collector at the same time. You don't keep staring in the mirror at yourself, you turn your eyes to Jesus. Because the whole point of the Sabbath, The whole point of the law, the whole point of everything going on here is that Jesus actually is our Sabbath rest. In him, we find the freedom to cease from our striving, to trust his grace, to trust his provision. And as we receive that soul level Sabbath rest from Jesus, our hearts are then energized with that very compassion extended to us, that we might extend it to the dying world around us, experiencing true righteousness, freedom from sin, care for the poor and the marginalized. Let us not return to the old way of Pharisaical righteousness or our old ways of living in the sinful flesh, but let us embrace the new way of Jesus, a way of forgiveness, love, compassion, mercy, concern for the marginalized, and a way of righteousness and freedom from sin because of the grace and forgiveness that Jesus extends. And so I'll end with this. Jesus has brought to us a new way of knowing God by his authority over sin and through his righteous compassion and mercy. So if you find yourself to be a Pharisee or a tax collector or both, you're in good company because it's every single one of us. And when you come face to face with the reality of who you are, you look not to yourself but to Jesus. And you find in him the forgiveness, the healing, and the rest that you need. God bless you.